Castle or their or his affiliates are not responsible for followers' use of the information provided here.
Hi everyone, Stephen Van Tassett here, wildlife control consultant, bringing another episode of Living the Wildlife as part of the Pest Geek podcast family. Hey, glad to have you on board. I hope your week went well. I had a shorter than usual week because I had an appointment that I had to go to down in Billings this past week, so I only had a 4-day week, but it was still pretty busy. That, along with my fire. I'm not a firefighter, but I'm a fire engineer. So I had some training on Tuesday night. So I'm glad for the weekend, but it's certainly as you get older, it's harder to recover, to be sure. Do hope you take a few moments, if you would, to subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you can be notified of future updates. Also, if you can send us, put on a review, give us a 5-star review, that would be awesome as well. Those of you that don't want to deal with YouTube, you can certainly visit me over on Rumble. Let me show you my page on Rumble, and this is where I'm at with Rumble, and you can see my podcasts are listed there. So if you just gotta go in here in the search box and go wildlife control consultant, and there you go. I had another one over here. I'm not sure how to turn that off, but the one you want is the one over to the left because it has most of my content. That's where I'm putting it now. But we're glad to have you on board in whichever way that is. Of course, if you're looking for some of my items, just go to my store and you can see my store here, some of the publications that I have. I am working on a new one. I do have a draft version here, and so you can see it. It does exist. I've revised Dr. Frischman's book. It's gone out to some reviewers, and so I'm getting some feedback. And one of the criticisms I'm getting is that people don't like to. They say some of the people want the answers directly below the question, and I can certainly understand that. The problem that I would suggest that people haven't maybe thought clearly enough, although when I put out a little survey looking for people's feedback, some of them did say that they thought it made for lazy thinking. And so, to be clear, the answers are not in the back of the book. They're after each section. So I have a section here on true-false questions related to rodenticides. At the end of that section, which is only 50 questions, the answers are there. So it's only like you have to flip back, in this case, one, maybe 2 pages, depending on the situation. So there is a benefit for making you think about the question and perhaps formulate an answer in your head and then see the answer, rather than just being able to kind of like cheat. Oh, I knew that. Well, of course, if you're honest with yourself, you know that we all do that. We're like, oh yeah, I knew what that was. When in fact, maybe you really didn't. Because if you're looking for testing and really knowing if you know something, you need to be able to generate it in your head, not just recognize the answer. Oh, anyways, I digress. But we're still working on it. I'm still waiting for some of my reviews back. If you are interested in doing a review, you need to contact me quickly. Because I am looking to publish this next year. I am kind of wondering if I should wait for the EPA's new rodenticide rules. But I don't know when those are coming out, so I'm at a little bit of a conundrum here. All right, well, enough about me and my situation. So let's talk about what we're going to deal with today. So I would like to talk about some of the myths that trappers believe. So let me get my slideshow up here. And there it is. So myth trappers believe and tell. Now, I understand that many of you are saying, I'm not a trapper. Okay, I'll get that. But the fact of the matter is that whether you are a fur trapper or whether you're a predator controller, whether you're a wildlife control operator, whether you're someone in the pest control industry that's dabbling in vertebrate pest control, sooner or later, you're going to be involved in some kind of trapping. I mean, I think that's just the reality. I do have difficulty believing that even people that do exclusion, one-way doors, that they are never involved in trapping. It could be minimal, but in effect, trapping is still a major tool, and it's going to be hard to understand how we're ever going to handle a variety of jobs without using traps to one way or another. So basically, this is my little spiel to try to get us to start thinking about some of the stories we tell ourselves and tell others. And so what do I mean by the word myth? So the word myth actually is a story that helps us make sense of the world. You may say, well, what do you mean about that? Well, think about the fairy tales that we're told as children, Jack and the Beanstalk, about the importance of, following directions, or Little Red Riding Hood, or Hansel and Gretel. What are those stories telling us about the world around us and how we should behave? Aesop's fables, for example, are to teach us a particular moral story. Well, those are myths and tales to help us make sense of our world, in the sense how we should behave, what is right, what is wrong, what is good, what is evil, what our story is. Sometimes you'll have myths about how a culture began, or you will have something that helps us. How do we differentiate ourselves from others? Now, when people hear the word myth, they often say, well, it's a lie. And I'm using the word myth here in the academic sense, where it's not a lie in the sense that 2 plus 2 doesn't equal 5. It's not that kind of a lie, but it is a way of framing our understanding of reality. So in this sense, you'll have people say, like, I'm a Christian, for example. They would say, well, you as a Christian, your myth is that God created the universe in 7 days. Whether those were, millennial days or 24-hour days or something in between, that is your myth. So now, I happen to believe that God did create the world, and that the world did not exist, matter did not exist prior to God creating it. But other religious traditions will say certainly that matter and spirit existed co-eternally. Those are foundation stories where they help us understand the world. Well, those of us in the wildlife control field, we have our stories as well. Now, they're not as broad or as expansive or foundational as a creation story, for example. But nevertheless, they do help us sort of feel better about ourselves, or to explain to those outside of our work why we do what we do is good versus evil, and how people need to accept what we say. And so we're going to step on some toes today, and if you're one of those who get really, who don't like criticisms, well, this is going to be a little bit of a problem for you, because this is where I criticize my own tradition in the sense of who I work for, the wildlife control operators. And I think it's important for us to turn a mirror on ourselves. You've heard me criticize the animal rights protest industry frequently in this podcast. This is our opportunity to be thinking about what are we doing, and not telling things as accurately or perhaps as unvarnished as they should be. So let me highlight a few of these stories. First one will be Conibears kill instantly. How many of you ever heard that? Okay, I have. I haven't heard it often, but I have heard it. Another story that we use is trapping is highly regulated. I see that even in some of the literature put forth by agencies, for example. Dogproof traps are dogproof. Okay. Translocation is humane. So these are 4. I would welcome if you have others that I haven't listed here. Definitely you can reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. I would love to hear what you think are some of the stories or myths that we use to convince ourselves that we're doing something that is right or justifying ourselves versus those bad animal rights protest industry activists. So let me explain why I think these four are myths, in the sense that these are stories we use to tell our place in the world. So let's start with the first one. What was my first story? Conibears kill instantly. So let me kind of set the table here a little bit about how we understand what humane trapping is. Now, you can disagree with this standard or not. My point is not to argue that this is the correct standard. What I'm arguing here is that this is a standard that the United States and Canada agreed upon when they were arguing with the European Union about trap standards. And I don't want to go down the rabbit hole, the politics of all that. But nevertheless, the idea being is that if we're using Conibear style traps, and those are swing jaw traps that are designed or purposed to try to kill the animal by crushing its chest or choking it out on the neck. So these, the Canada and the European community in the United States agreed upon these standards for judging humane kill traps. And that is the time to unconsciousness. Now, you've heard me talk about this before. And that is when we're dealing with humaneness, the goal is to, how long does it take for that animal to no longer feel pain or no longer suffer? Remember, suffering and pain are intellectual concepts. They're not just physical concepts, they're intellectual concepts. So the idea being is, if the animal is no longer conscious, it can no longer experience pain and suffering. It's simply not biologically possible. So this is why the standard is how long it takes for the trap to render the animal unconscious. Whether it's technically dead or not. Dead is typically understood as the cessation of respiration or the cessation of heartbeat. How long that takes is kind of irrelevant because the animal's no longer suffering. And that's why they use the unconscious standard. And so the limits were stated as 80% of the traps, 80% of the captures, not traps, 80% of the captures should render the animal unconscious, and they have different stages, at a 95% confidence interval. Now, confidence interval is a standard in statistics saying that you have to have a large enough sample size to ensure that your data is not simply a fluke. So you have to have a confidence interval of 95%. So what are those standards? That a mink animal needs to be unconscious within 45 seconds. That's 80% of the mink captured in order for a trap to meet the standard. So if you're testing, let's say, a 110 Conibear manufactured by XYZ company, and they test the mink, 80% of the mink have to be unconscious within 45 seconds for that trap to pass the standard. Okay. Now, what's the standard for a marten? Well, the standard for a marten was that 80% of them needed to be unconscious within 120 seconds, basically 2 minutes. All other species had to be rendered unconscious, 80% of them, within 300 seconds. And by the way, these are for dry land sets, so this is not a Conibear set underwater. Okay. And here's what they found in terms of the research. They found that 30% of the martens were caught in non-lethal areas. Well, basically we would know that as a hip catch. Maybe it's a catch of a leg, the catch of a back leg or a limb, or maybe sometimes an animal will get caught on the skull, but it's not in such a way that it breaks the skull. It's able to just sit there and wait for you to arrive. 30%. Another study found that 280s, using 280 traps. We're not talking about 220s. 220 is a pretty powerful trap, but these are 280s. It's a particular kind of Conibear trap. That they were unable to get more than 50% of the raccoon to unconsciousness in less than 3 minutes. That's amazing, right? So you may say, well, Stephen, that's, maybe they're going to be unconscious in 4 minutes or 5 minutes. Yeah, I get it. We can argue about what the standard should be. The point is that they don't kill instantly. That's the bottom line. And so when we talk to our clients, we need to be accurate in our talking to them about what a Conibear does. And so it's important for us not to oversell what our equipment does, because the fact is that raccoons are pretty powerful animals, and a Conibear doesn't kill them instantly. And if you are able to get a raccoon unconscious instantly with a Conibear trap, that's awesome, But the likelihood of that happening is extraordinarily low. And so don't oversell what these traps do and don't do. We need to do more research. We need to have better equipment and technology. But nevertheless, I seriously doubt that technology will ever get us to the place, probably not at least in my lifetime, to the place where animals are killed, quote unquote, with maybe even under a minute, or put unconscious in under a minute. I think that's going to be very hard, because part of the challenge is we have to have equipment that's safe for us to use. So it's not just simply that the trap can bring the animal to unconsciousness rapidly, but it also has to be safe for us to use, right? Just look at the ram snare. I mean, that device, when I had my first encounter with it, it shocked me. I was like, holy cow, man, you make a mistake with this is going to hurt. Not a criticism of the trap per se, but just you better have your wits about you when you're working with that thing. It's not the place to be distracted, because that is a extraordinarily powerful snare. So keep that in mind. Well, that's the first myth. I'll let you think about that for a little bit. What I call the first myth, and that is Conibear traps, they don't kill instantly. How about another one that we hear, and that is trapping is highly regulated. And so I just want to ask this question, is it really? I know that's a talking point to try to defend trapping, and I would argue that yes, trapping is regulated. I'm not sure I would use the word highly, because highly in comparison to what? Is it more regulated than an electrician? Or is it just highly regulated in comparison to fishing or hunting? Now, that may be debatable, but highly regulated, it sounds great. It means that it gives people the assurance or the feeling that, okay, the government is looking out on trappers to make sure they're following the rules. And I would just simply say, in terms of the effect, not really. I don't think so. And so, because what you're trying to do is you're trying to convince the listener, when you tell them that trapping is highly regulated, you're trying to tell them that the government's really watching us. And I don't think that's really true. That's not true. And so we could be highly regulated, but not highly monitored. Maybe that's the way we should phrase it, right? So if we're highly regulated, we're not really monitored, but I'm not even sure we're highly regulated. When you compare us to other trades, for example, I would just say an electrician or a plumber or other types of businesses. How about someone dealing with hair, for example? If you are a beautician, is it easier to become a beautician or is it easier to become a trapper? Which one is highly regulated? Maybe. So I think we really need to think carefully about this. Let me just bring up a link here. I'm going to bring this one over. And this is a particular publication that I want you to think about. And that is a summary of trapping regulations for fur harvesting in the United States. Now, it's a little old. It's 2007. But I don't think the regulations have changed that dramatically over the last, what do we have here, 10, 15 years, right? So I would just encourage you to look at it and ask yourself, is this really that regulated? Probably, and I would just say probably not. But I will agree that someone could have a different take on this because again, what are we comparing ourselves to? But I'm just not sure it's that accurate myself. Dog-proof traps. Are they really dog-proof? Well, possibly, but let's think about the non-target catches that traps that are called dog-proof actually catch. Skunk, mice, cat, that's house cat, fox. Is that really target specific? Now, those aren't dogs, to be sure, but what makes an encapsulated foot trap, which I think is a more accurate way of talking about them, what makes them so resistant to dogs? And the reason is simply this. Here I have a picture of a dog footprint in the soil, and then I just basically put a circle over it to just show you sort of like what the size of the hole is. The reason for these traps working is that it requires the raccoon to stick their hand down a hole in order to get the bait that's inside. And a dog's paw, at least the ones that are often out in the woods, is often too big to fit into the trap. Now, that's kind of debatable for some traps, because some of the traps there, the one on the left, for example, probably is big enough to allow some smaller dogs in. So is it really dog-proof, or should we really say it's dog-resistant? Granted, it doesn't slip off the tongue as easily, but to say that it never or can't catch a dog, I'm not so sure about that. I would love to get your thoughts on that. Certainly, I have no doubt that it is a great trap. It is these devices are great traps, and they have revolutionized raccoon trapping in the United States. And I'm really glad that they were invented. However, to say that they're dog proof, I'm not as convinced of. Certainly their efficacy rate has been outstanding, but when I owned a dachshund, could my dachshund get her paw into those? Maybe not all of them, but I'm wondering if one of them certainly could. I'll leave that for you to decide. I'm just not sure it's a phrase we should use. I would rather have us use encapsulated foot trap and say that it's dog resistant. Translocation is humane is the third one. How often have you heard that one? Probably your clients even believe it. Now, what is translocation? Now, those of you who have been following my channel here understand I've mentioned this numerous times. So relocation is the capture and movement of an animal and its release in an area within the animal's home range. Now, the home range is where the animal normally is doing its hunting, living, feeding, mating, all that. That's the home range of the animal. Home range would be, for example, for you, where your home is located, where do you go to work, where do you shop, where do you recreate. Okay, that is your home range. Translocation is the capture and movement and release of an animal outside of its home range. So, for example, if your home range is only a square mile and someone dumps you 5 miles away, well, then you've been dumped into an area that you're not familiar with. It's sort of like how I explain it to people here in Montana. I will say, you don't like your neighbor, but you don't want to kill them, so you basically capture your neighbor, you slap a parachute on them, you fly over Yellowstone National Park and push them out the door, you watch the parachute release, and you watch them float down into the wilderness. Well, you haven't killed them, but is it humane? That's translocation, right? So you've moved the animal into a part of the world that they are not familiar with. So what's the problem with that? Well, let me give you a few problems with it. Number one, let's say you're doing this in the wintertime. So now you have an animal that's already, you've captured the animal, now you're releasing it in wintertime where there's fewer resources. What about if it's even in the summertime? What if you have a diurnal animal and you're releasing it at night or at dusk? Now he's only got, what, half an hour to find shelter while avoiding predators? Because you didn't release him in the morning, where at least he has a day to reorient himself? What kind of resources were available in the location where you dumped them? Was there enough food? Was there enough water? Was there enough shelter? See, Americans have this mythology that suggests that somehow we have these empty wildernesses or empty wooded areas where there's no other animal there and it's just, well, so bring us your raccoon. These places don't exist. Now, when you have wildlife agencies doing a translocation and release when they're trying to expand an animal's range back to its historic area, or they're trying to help an animal prevent it from becoming threatened or endangered, they go through the research and find out, is this location actually suitable for the animal where we're going to be dumping it? How do we make sure that the animal has a fighting chance? Sometimes they'll create nest boxes, or for other animals they'll create dens for them and make sure that there's sufficient food supplies. They do it when the weather is good. They'll do it when conditions are as good as they can expect. And they sometimes they may even do predation control for a period of time. I don't know. So there's a variety of ways that they try to give the animal a fighting chance. Because remember, the animal also has to avoid predators and avoid conspecifics. Conspecifics is a raccoon has to avoid other raccoons and it might beat them up. So those are all barriers to translocation. So is that really humane? You may say, well, it beats the animal, at least has a fighting chance. Okay, I agree. The animal has a fighting chance. But what if it's diseased? Now you've moved a diseased animal to a new area. Now you've infected those other animals. Or if it's healthy and now you've moved it to an area where there is disease, is there a likelihood of it catching that disease? Right? So it cuts both ways. I can't really call that humane. And so I just want to think of that as another one that I believe is a myth that trappers like ourselves like to tell ourselves and others. Here's some data for you if you're not believing. And by the way, you can find other studies that will probably have, like with raccoons, where the survival was significantly higher. But here's one study that was done that said 97% of the gray squirrels died within 88 days. Does that sound like a success? Another study on raccoons found that 43% died within 74 days. Another one said 50% survived in 90 days. Those aren't great numbers. You can say, well, but now we have 43% raccoons that we didn't have before. Yep, I get it. But how much longer did those animals? What was the health condition of those animals? Were they surviving in the sense that they were, someone crawling across the desert? Like, yeah, they survived. Or are they thriving? Are they actually healthy? Are they going to survive the coming winter? Those are questions that we definitely have to think about. So these are some examples as to why I'm not sure it's necessarily humane to translocate an animal, even in those states where it's legal to do so. So what's our bottom line here? I want us to be thinking of, whether you agree or disagree with my opinion about these various myths that I call them, is I want you to think carefully about how we talk about our industry and are we being accurate. I'm a big fan of telling people the unvarnished truth. And I think that's something as an industry we need to think long and hard about. It may cost you money in the short term, but I'm telling you that if we continue to tell people things that aren't the full story, it's going to bite us. And because once people discover that we're not telling them the whole story, it's going to be hard for them to trust you. Say, I know politicians, they lie all the time and get reelected. Yes, I get that. Part of that's because Americans will not elect anyone who tells the truth. We will not tolerate it. The difference there is that in politics, it's about power. And unfortunately, we don't have the power. So we can't afford to lie to people or to shade the truth because we don't have the resources to keep correcting things. And we need, when we do speak, which is often rarely, too rarely in my opinion, when we do speak, we need to have the credibility from someone who says, yes, I know this person's telling the truth, because when they talk, they even tell us the bad news that makes them look bad. One of the ways we evaluate, let's say, historical information is, did the person speak in a manner that's contrary to self-interest? Are you more likely to believe a witness who tells you they committed a crime as opposed to someone who said, well, I saw this occur, but I didn't do anything wrong? When someone speaks against self-interest, it does give credibility to them. And I tell people flat out what I do for a living. What do I do for a living? I teach people how to kill stuff. That's what I tell them. Now, I'm not in the position of you that I don't go out and make my living each day capturing animals and removing them for people. But I have the benefit of making this a little bit harsher than it should be. And I'm not suggesting that you say that to people. What I am saying is that we got to make sure that we're not just trying to put a positive spin on something because we're not willing to address the reality of what we're doing. What we do is sometimes not pretty. And as one person said, I won't mention his name because he doesn't like me very much, but the point is, he was spot on correct. We do things to protect the emotional well-being of our clients because they can't do it. Not that they can't physically do it, but they can't emotionally do it. So we protect them. It's why we have an undertaker take care of our family. It's not that we can't take care of our dying family. It's because they shield us from that pain. And that's the reality of it. Well, those are some myths that I believe that we talk to ourselves in our particular industry. Do share with us some of your thoughts. I'd love to hear from you. You can reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, or you can even mention them on our Facebook group, Pest Geek Podcast Facebook group. Love to hear from you there. You can reach me. I'm monitoring that particular page as well. But would love to hear you. Perhaps if you have ideas for future shows, perhaps you'd like to be on the show, would love to hear from you. You can reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. There's no charge. I'm not charging you for anything. I'm a big fan of getting new information and businesses and stories out to our industry. And we have the ability with the Pest Geek podcast that I'm doing, obviously Living the Wildlife, the vertebrate portion, is that we can talk about things in depth in a manner that other people don't. So we talk about things that are going to be geeky, right? Because we want to be masters of the information that we're dealing with so that we can serve our clients properly. Hope you enjoyed the show. Again, this is Living the Wildlife as part of the Pest Geek podcast family. Why do we call it Living the Wildlife? Well, because we want you to live the wildlife, not be the wildlife. Take care, everybody.